Welcome to Voice of Stories. Discover tales that inspire, captivate, and bring words to life. Subscribe for unforgettable stories.
Scene 1. Sophie's struggle. Sophie felt the weight pressing on her chest as she woke up. Emily had asked her softly if she'd slept well, but Sophie just nodded, not wanting to explain how she felt. She wondered if Emily would ever truly listen, if she even cared enough to understand. After school, Sophie rushed to Margarita's house, her backpack tightly clutched. The weather had turned colder, with autumn leaves swirling across the quiet street. Margarita was waiting for her near the PCH, her scarf loosely draped around her neck, the old diary resting on her lap. "Come in, sweetheart," Margarita greeted warmly, opening the screen door. Sophie stepped inside, immediately feeling the comfort of the cozy living room. Old furniture and framed photos lined the walls, the smell of lavender and something baking filling the air. It reminded her faintly of her mother. Margarita patted the couch beside her and handed the diary to Sophie. "I had a friend help me open it," she said, "but I didn't read it. It's for you." Sophie's fingers brushed over the cracked leather cover as she opened the first page. The handwriting was familiar, neat and careful, just like the letter she had found earlier. "Dear Diary, I don't know how much longer I can do this. Brian watches my every move, and Emily, she doesn't suspect a thing yet. He's so careful around her, pretending to be perfect. But when we're alone, he's different." Sophie's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages, each entry painting a clearer picture of her mother's life under Brian's control. Sophie clenched her fists as one passage stood out. "I wanted to leave last night. I packed a bag for Sophie and me, but then he found it. He didn't yell or hit me. He just smiled and said, 'Where would you go? No one would believe you.'" Margarita placed a gentle hand on Sophie's shoulder. "Take your time, sweetheart," she said softly. "You don't have to read it all at once." But Sophie couldn't stop. She kept reading, each entry revealing more of her mother's struggle. Things Sophie never knew, things she wished she didn't know. "I'm here for you, Sophie," Margarita said. "You don't have to go through this alone. We can go to the police together." Sophie hesitated, thinking of the last time the police had come and how easily Brian had manipulated them. "He'll just lie," Sophie whispered. "He's good at it." Margarita nodded thoughtfully. "Then we'll need more proof, something they can't ignore." Scene 2. The confrontation. As Sophie walked home that evening, clutching the diary tightly against her chest, she saw Brian's car in the driveway. Her stomach dropped. She wasn't supposed to be late. She pushed open the door quietly, but Brian was already waiting in the living room, his eyes locking onto hers the moment she stepped inside. "Where were you?" he asked, his tone calm but cold. "I stayed after school," Sophie lied, her voice trembling. Brian tilted his head, studying her. "You sure about that? Because Margarita's house is in the opposite direction from school." Sophie's heart stopped. How did he know? "I wasn't at her house," she stammered. Brian stepped closer, his shadow towering over her. "Don't lie to me," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "What were you doing there?" Emily appeared in the doorway, wringing her hands. "Brian, leave her alone," she said softly. "She's just a kid." Brian shot her a glare that made Emily shrink back. "Stay out of this," he snapped. "This is between me and Sophie." Sophie's mind raced. If he found out about the diary, he'd destroy it, just like he had the letters. "I was just saying hi," Sophie blurted out. "She waved at me, so I went to say hi, that's all." Brian studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Fine, but stay away from that house, understand?" Sophie nodded quickly, a wave of relief washing over her as he turned and walked away. Emily lingered, her face pale. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Sophie nodded again, but her hands were still shaking. Scene 3. The diary's disappearance. That night, Sophie hid the diary under a loose floorboard in her room. She couldn't risk Brian finding it, not when it held so many of her mother's truths. But the next morning, she found Emily sitting in the kitchen, staring out the window with a vacant expression. "Mom," Sophie said, her voice soft. Emily turned, startled. "Yes, sweetheart." Sophie hesitated. "Did you know about the diary?" she asked. Emily froze, her eyes widening. "Diary? What diary?" Sophie felt a sharp pang of frustration. "Maria's diary," she said. "I found it in the basement. She wrote about everything." Emily sank into a chair, her face crumpling. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't know she kept one." Sophie sat down across from her, her gaze intense. "Why didn't you stop him? Why didn't you help her?" Emily buried her face in her hands. "I was scared," she admitted. "He wasn't like this when we first met. By the time I realized who he really was, it was too late. I thought if I kept quiet, I could protect you. But I've only made things worse." Sophie didn't know what to say. For the first time, she saw the cracks in Emily's facade, the fear and guilt that had been hiding behind her silence. Scene 4. The warning. Later that afternoon, Sophie noticed Margarita's porch was empty. A chill ran down her spine when she saw Brian's car parked a few houses down. His engine was idling, but the windows were too dark to see inside. Sophie forced herself to keep walking, but her heart was pounding. What if he was at Margarita's house? When Sophie reached home, Emily was in the kitchen holding up a letter. It was from Child Protective Services. "They're coming for a home visit," Emily said, her voice trembling. Someone filed a report. Sophie's stomach dropped. It had to be Margarita. "That's good, right?" Sophie asked, trying to remain hopeful. "They can help us." But Emily shook her head. "You don't understand. Brian will find a way to turn it around. He always does." Sophie's chest tightened. Could they really stop him this time? Scene 5. The breaking point. The tension in the house was unbearable that evening as Brian paced the living room, muttering under his breath about how they thought they could interfere with his family. Emily hovered nearby, her hands wringing nervously. "I'll handle it," Brian snapped when Emily suggested they leave things alone. Sophie kept her head down, trying to stay out of his way, but her mind raced. If CPS was coming, they needed real evidence, something Brian couldn't explain away. That night, Sophie lay in bed, thinking about the diary and wondering if it would be enough. But when she went to retrieve it the next day, it was gone. The floorboard was disturbed and the diary was missing. Her heart raced. Someone had been in her room. As she stood there, panic setting in, her eyes fell on Emily, who was standing at the door, looking pale and uneasy. Scene 6. A glimmer of hope. Later, Emily woke Sophie early, her eyes red from lack of sleep. "Get dressed," Emily said quietly, her voice barely audible. Sophie followed her without asking questions. Emily drove in silence, her hands gripping the wheel tightly, glancing nervously in the rearview mirror. Finally, they arrived at a small diner. Emily parked the car but didn't get out right away. "I need to tell you something," Emily said, her voice trembling. Sophie waited, her heart pounding. "I've been afraid," Emily said. "Afraid of Brian, afraid of what he might do if I ever stood up to him. But last night I realized something." "What?" Sophie asked softly. Emily's tears brimmed. "I've been failing you," she said. "I've been so scared of him that I've let him hurt you. I'm sorry, Sophie. I'm so sorry." Sophie didn't know how to respond. A part of her wanted to forgive Emily, but another part of her was still angry. Angry at all the times Emily had stood by and done nothing. "I'm going to fix this," Emily promised, her voice firm. "I don't know how yet, but I will. I promise." Sophie nodded, but the knot in her chest didn't loosen. Promises were just words. What she needed was action. As they returned home, Sophie's mind spun. The diary, the CPS visit, Margarita's warning, all of it was building toward something, but Sophie didn't know what. As she reached her room, she froze. The floorboard where she had hidden the diary was slightly out of place. Panic set in as she crouched down, praying it was still there. But when she reached into the small space, her fingers met only emptiness. The diary was gone. Her mind raced. Who had taken it? Was it Brian? Had he found it? Sophie stood up, her heart pounding. She couldn't let this be the end. She had to find a way to stop Brian and finally uncover the truth.